She discovered the truth by accident, a casual glance at a bank notification that arrived on her phone while she was making tea, the little ping cutting through the quiet of the morning like a blade. For months, she had kept her life separate from the shabby, ritualized world that lived in her mother's house. Weekend visits, polite smiles, the obligation dinners, the recurring small humiliations wrapped in jokes about being lucky and you're doing so well. She had built herself up from nothing. Odd jobs stitched together into a freelance career that finally bloomed into something solid, long hours, and an iron will that translated into a bank account big enough to rent a small apartment in the city, to take clients seriously, to breathe. She had chosen to hide her income not from shame but from strategy. Privacy as armor against the family's habits of asking, of assuming, of taking. Then the notification. A withdrawal, a transfer, a note in handwriting she recognized immediately. Her brother's, demanding a monthly handout of $5,000, the sum written like a verdict, like a sentence that assumed she existed to service their appetites. The shock was not only the brazenness, it was the logic behind it, the entitlement that meant they believed they could extort her, the casual cruelty of turning blood into a line item. Her mother, who had raised her with a string of bitter aphorisms about survival and complaint, had always smiled with a softness that coated sharpness. Now that softness hardened into complicity. The first wave was disbelief, then denial, then the slump of someone who had been struck where she kept her dignity. She confronted them that night, trying to keep her voice level, trying to ask for an explanation she didn't expect to get. Her mother smiled in that way. People smile when they are rehearsing a role. The wounded matriarch, the one who had nothing and deserved help. Her brother folded his arms like a man in a play and told her openly that she had the money and now she must share it, that $5,000 a month was not a demand but a family law. The room closed around her with the smell of old perfume and stale anger, childhood images, the patched curtains, the broken ceiling fan, the laundry line, rearranged themselves into evidence for their case and against her. For a while she tried bargaining and reasoning. Smaller sums, one-time help, a repayment plan. Each concession was met with a higher ask until she realized they were not negotiating but grooming. The more she gave, the more they wanted. The more she resisted, the meaner they grew. Their love, she discovered, had been conditional, defined by what she could be made to surrender. In the months that followed, she oscillated between scorched indignation and a cold planning. Revenge did not have to be about violence or spectacle. Revenge, in her mind, could be a reclamation of self, a dismantling of the architecture that permitted exploitation. So she began to play a different game. She kept living. She kept sending funds only when it suited her narrative. But behind the small gestures, she built a quiet dossier. She saved copies of messages, recorded conversations where consent dissolved into command, made careful screenshots of the bank transfers and the handwritten demands. She learned the language of contracts and tenancy and the particular cruelty of informal economies that target kin. She watched how her mother curated pity in public and how at gatherings her mother's smile dissolved into sharp commentary about how lucky some daughters were when they helped the family. In deeper work, she stayed present at family gatherings, not to be passive but to be a spy, to see who took what, who coaxed who, to catalog the small cruelties that added up to a pattern. The revenge she crafted was surgical. First, she cut off the easy supply. She changed account numbers, set up automations, built a buffer that insulated her from the sudden grasping hand. When her mother called with a tremor that was more calculation than heartache, she answered in a voice that was politely unmoved. She didn't scold. She didn't threaten. She simply declared boundaries. Money would be sent under clear conditions and with receipts. Requests would be formal, not emotional blackmail. Any future demand would be met with a refusal unless accompanied by plans for accountability. The refusal was a mirror. They couldn't stand their reflection. Her brother's first reaction was anger, the old theatrics and threats. But when those failed, he turned to cruelty, whisper campaigns to relatives, accusations that she had become arrogant, veiled comments about her being ungrateful. She let those whispers pass. She had expected them and had built clay shields to absorb them. Where cruelty rose, she introduced consequence. She began quietly, to reveal the truth to the people who mattered. Cousins who still took their side, neighbors who ate at their table, a few friends who had always been fond of her and whose judgment she trusted. She did not seek to humiliate her mother in public at first. She wanted to dismantle the stage where her mother performed victimhood. She took her evidence to a social worker who specialized in familial financial abuse and to a cousin who happened to be an accountant. They helped her map the ways money flowed and who benefited. Together they created a plan that would force accountability, formal documentation for requests, a small escrow where money for family needs could be placed with third-party oversight when authorized, and a legal letter that described the pattern of coercion politely but unequivocally. When the letter arrived on a brittle envelope written with lawyerly neutrality, the house's air changed. Her mother read it with a hand that trembled for a second, then steadied into the practiced composure of someone who refused to be stripped of dignity. Pride, however, is a fickle shield. Once the law stood between them and the informal understandings they had always enjoyed, the family retreated into private bargaining. That should have been the end, but revenge, the sort that satisfies, requires a deeper ethical strike. To expose not merely the deed but the rationale, to make the selfishness visible so that the world could see the choice they made. She did not drag them on social media. She did not scream. Instead, she used the truth as leverage to demand more than money. She demanded transformation or departure. She proposed, with a calm that had an edge, that they either enroll in financial counseling and follow a plan to regain dignity, or she would cut ties in every sense, remove them from her will, stop attending family events, and refuse further assistance. It was a lever into which she poured all the energy of her long-suppressed hurt, and it cracked them open. For her brother, who relied on her as a steady resource, the pressure began to show in the small ways. Missed rent notices, apologies that tasted like calculation, a sudden need to be seen as a trying. For her mother, who had once prided herself on being needed, the choice was worse. Or be alone with the knowledge that her affection had been transactional. The first time her brother slipped, texting her an urgent list of needs disguised as crises, she did not comply. She read the messages to the social worker and the cousin. They issued the mild but firm reprimand that made him blush with shame and rage in equal measure. The humiliation lodged in him and curdled into resentment. Yet even as she sharpened defenses, she did not harden into cruelty herself. Her revenge was not to become them, but to outlive them. She invested quietly and with fierce discipline in a future that would make their demands irrelevant. She bought a small apartment that she paid for in cash, signed a contract that placed her independent assets outside their legal reach, and funded a rainy day fund the size of a fortress. She cultivated friendships in a chosen family who did not count her worth in cash flows, who celebrated her successes without expectation. In the subtle world of personal revenge, the slow accumulation of autonomy is an exquisite weapon. But the story of revenge is not a single melody, it is a chorus of minor keys. Sometimes she craved vindication of a different kind, to show them their faces reflected in other people's eyes. She found a way to do that, not by public shaming, but by gently rerouting the pity game they played so effectively. When a neighbor she had once helped saw how her mother had been training her to be the ATM, she started to call her mother's bluff at community gatherings, offering platitudes of her own. "We all chip in," the neighbor would say, and the mother, accustomed to applause, would find only polite smiles. Little by little, the circuit of sympathy that once fed her mother's performance eroded. The more ordinary people refused to play their parts as enablers, the more isolated the amphitheater of entitlement became. That social erosion was slow and satisfying in a way that bombs and fireworks never are. By day, revenge, she learned, is as much about creating a life that makes your old life seem like a bad dream as it is about punishing. She also learned restraint. Once, in a moment of furious clarity, she almost sent an email that would have destroyed reputations. An exposé of their greed that included details of their manipulations to extended family members, clients, and neighbors. She pictured the ripple, the stunned faces, the fall from their pedestals. She poised her finger over the send key and paused. Then she deleted the draft, She realized cruelty could become its own poison. To win for good, she had to win without becoming the monster that provoked her, so her victories were quieter but more complete. She negotiated a modest, continuing support plan for truly legitimate needs, medical bills, the occasional repair. But everything required documentation and a plan. She insisted on transparency, and slowly, very slowly, her mother learned to ask for help rather than demand it. Her brother learned the humbling art of repayment, not because he had a sudden moral revelation, but because the structure forced it. There were setbacks, times when the old dynamics surged and threatened to sweep her under. Once, after a hospital scare that turned out to be minor, her mother called in a panic and then in the aftermath pulled at every old scab, demanding money and attention as if insurance and calls had not already been made. She was tempted to snap and to leave them in ruin. Instead, she chose to be maddeningly ordinary. She paid for the cab, arranged the appointment, and then in the car on the way home, she set new boundaries. She said simply, "I will help when it is real. I will not help when it's performance." The clarity of that sentence cut deeper than anger ever could. In the public sphere of family dinner tables and weddings, she wielded her independence like a quiet banner. When relatives murmured about her coldness, she took it as an observation and not as an attack. She cultivated a life of small luxuries she afforded herself. A painting for her apartment, a weekend away with friends who respected her, a job that paid decently, and whose clients treated her like a professional rather than a charity. Her growth was visible and not a matter of posturing. New responsibilities, new projects, mentorship of someone younger. And in every success was an implicit response to the old demand. "I am not yours to suck dry." Time, that slow and patient ally, did more damage to their entitlement than any confrontation could. Her brother's swagger dwindled into a stooped hustle. Her mother's performances lost their edge and became crisper with apology. The apologies were not instantaneous redemptions. They were tentative, sometimes selfish, sometimes blank, but they were there, and she accepted them on her terms. She did not demand grand theatrical repentance on a family stage. She wanted steady change. In the years that followed, she also found love. Not the melodramatic romance of novels, but a steady companionship with someone who had watched her navigate the storms and who loved her for her autonomy, not her ability to finance someone else's comfort. That relationship became a new axis of safety, a life built with mutuality rather than extraction. And yet, revenge is not a straight line toward happiness. There were moments of regret, of loneliness at holidays when other families crowded close in a way hers never had, of small aches where she missed what might have been if love and kindness had been the family currency. Those aches she learned to hold without bargaining. She told herself softly that grief and rage could coexist, that the same heart that had been betrayed could still be generous, but on conditions that honored her dignity. The final act of her revenge was not a flourish but an inheritance of behavior. She refused to perpetuate the cycle. When her own niece asked for help for school, she gave it with contracts and mentorship, teaching the girl that support arrives with care and planning, that family does not mean blind consent. In doing so, she broke the chain that had once bound her. Years later, when her mother's health declined and the roles reversed in the dolorous theater of aging, she did not relish it. She took on caregiving with a mix of duty and a new, clear-eyed compassion. She cared as a person who had set boundaries and reclaimed herself, not as someone who had been reduced to a bank account. Her brother humbled and quieter, stopped asking for sums and started asking for help with his own life. Assistance in job applications, honest conversations about spending, the kind of help that enabled independence rather than dependence. In the end, her revenge, if you could call it revenge, had changed the shape of the family rather than simply scorched it. She had taken back the narrative, from being the one who paid to being the one who taught, from being the secret source to being the visible actor who refused to be consumed. She had not sought to destroy them. She had sought to survive without them extracting her. There were consequences, strained relationships that never fully healed, relatives who judged her long after change took root, a necklace of guilt she wore on certain nights when the house was too quiet. But there were also days she woke without panic in her chest, without the gnawing fear of being reduced to a resource to be mined. She walked through bazaars and cafes paying for her own coffee and sometimes for someone else's, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Her story, messy and human, closed not with a triumphant shout but with a steady breath. Revenge had been a teacher. It had taught her the hard art of self-preservation, the necessity of boundaries, the power of slow, legalistic, bureaucratic dismantling of entitlement. It taught her that love that seeks to drain must be refused, and that refusal can be both a scalpel and a bomb. If anything, the most bitter parts of the story softened into something like wisdom. She learned to say no without bitterness, to give without being taken, and to let the past be a lesson rather than a prison. The house where she had been raised still existed, with the same curtains and the same creaks, but visits were now scheduled and honest. Conversations had agendas and money had documents. Her mother sometimes called at night, voice thin with age and new remorse, and they spoke in ways that were careful and sometimes, improbably, tender. She thought often of the girl she had been, the one who had learned to hide success because transparency had previously invited exploitation. And she wanted to tell her younger self that the hard work of building a life worth defending was also the reward. In that truth lay the final quiet revenge. A life so full, so carefully tended, that the old wounds, while they never completely vanished, no longer defined the topography of her days.